So next up, we have Dawn Davis. Dawn is going to speak to habitat loss, decriminalization, conservation, and legalization frameworks of peyote. Dawn is a mother, a wife, and a PhD student at the University of Idaho in the Natural Resources Program. Her current research uses GIS as one tool to analyze the environmental and anthropogenic issues that surround the revered peyote plant, which is integral to her spiritual practice as a Shoshone-Bannock tribal woman. She is twice awarded the National Science Foundation recipient as a fellow under the Integrative Graduate Education Research Traineeship and as an Indigenous science, technology, engineer, and math scholar. Dawn has shared her research among Native American, academic, ethnobotanical, and psychedelic audiences nationally and internationally. She is also co-editor for the Journal of Native Sciences and founding director with the Source Research Foundation. So we are very much excited to hear your talk today, Dawn. It's been wonderful to get to know you a little bit. And just a reminder to everyone who's in the audience, you can put your questions down in the chat box and then I will ask them later on. Good morning, Dawn.
Good morning. I just got a notice that said it timed out. So I was just texting the text guy to tell him, I don't know what to do. It timed out. So hi, Ariel. Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you.
And,
the floor is yours.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. Please.
So I will just go right into my presentation.
Sounds wonderful.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So, yes, so good morning to everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you to Ariel for the lovely introduction, and to Bia and to the entire Chacruna team for all of their help in making this all happen. I know it's been a big change from switching it up from the live conference to an online platform. So all of that is appreciated. All that work is appreciated. So I am coming to you live from the basement of my home on the Fort Hall Indian Reservation, which is located here in Southeast Idaho. As Ariel shared, I am a Nua person, which is the Shoshone word for the people. I belong to the Shoshone-Bannock tribes. And I also have ties on my maternal side of the family to the Western Shoshone of Winnemucca, Nevada, and also paternal ties to the Wind River Shoshone of Wyoming. And so I'm presenting to you today the research that is part of my PhD dissertation. I plan to discuss several chapters and objectives. I will also delve into some discussion on peyote history, conservation, and decriminalization. But before I get into all of that, I wanted to burn some white sage to sort of ground ourselves and to bless everybody as well. Because peyote for me is one of my most sacred medicines, but water really is my first medicine. And so I just wanted to give you guys some white sage, some online virtual white sage, because, you know, for me, peyote and water, they're two very controversial natural resources for Native American people. And so the research that I do, it's personal, it's complicated, it's sacred, and it's also very challenging, especially as an Indigenous person. And so I always like to provide some clean space and good thoughts through burning the white sage. Especially in this time of the global pandemic that we're dealing with, you know, it's made me reevaluate my priorities and recognize that as we heal in our own homes, that Sogobia, Mother Earth, is also healing. So please bless yourself with this medicine. And please have an open mind as you hear what I would like to share as a researcher as an Indigenous person and as a Peyotist. So thank you for that. I also want to acknowledge my family because before anything, I'm a mother and I am also a wife. And so this is a picture of my family, my husband, Dr. Cleve Davis, and my two daughters, Isla Rain and Liliana Bigtree. Because without their support, I could not be a successful and functioning researcher, student, or human without their support. So there were many beautiful things that were shared yesterday, and I will probably share many of those same sentiments. So I hope that I can contribute at least a few new thoughts. So I've carried my research from my thesis into my PhD. Where I'm continuing to inquire about the future of the peyote cacti, particularly within the United States. And so my research consists of three primary inquiries, and that's looking at the delineation of a core garden, what a common garden looks like, and also describing the habitat and the vegetation, and also looking at what landowners' perspectives are. How do they feel about this plant that grows on their property? And so peyote, peyote, natsu, that's the Shoshone word for medicine. Wongowovi, that's the Bannock word for medicine. Peshuta, that's the Lakota word for medicine. Ze, I hope I said that right, is the Navajo word for medicine. And all of these terms are just the scientific identification of Lophophora williamsii. And so I refer to its most known reference, which is the natsu, or I just refer to it as peyote, but I also use the term medicine interchangeably, not just in my research, but in my life. And so peyote has been used as an entheogenic medicine, or an entheogenic medicinal sacrament by Indigenous peoples for at least 10,000 years. And the peyote religion, the Native American Church, as it is known in the United States and Canada, is similar to what I was raised with. I say similar because my family never called it or referred to our spiritual practice as being associated with the church. We called them meetings or ceremonies. And my ancestors held this spiritual practice of peyote use prior to the establishment of the Native American Church. And so today, however, Native Americans have been afforded legal protections for peyote use, transport, and possession under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act amendments of 1994. So the word church has replaced ceremony terminologically. Therefore, the research that I do comes from a very personal place. And I began to question the issue of peyote, particularly the size, based on a lifetime of ceremonial experience. I started noticing the diminishing sizes, questioning both the biological and environmental causes that could be attributing to this, but not really knowing that is what I was doing at the time. And so questions I began asking my grandmother eventually turned into a master's thesis. And that work was titled Preservation and Sustainability of the Peyote Sacrament in Reverence of the Native American Church. And that work advocated for policy regulations, for peyote harvesters regarding proper harvesting techniques, button size classification, rotation plans, conservation easements, education on peyote depletion and sustainable purchasing practices by Native American church members, and also the implementation of potential quantity quotas on sales transactions. And so I continue researching peyote and questioning the depletion that's occurring to the population and habitat from environmental and anthropogenic causes. Because peyote is a slow-growing cactus that requires between 5 to 10 years before it's considered harvestable, this is part of what makes the peyote habitat, which is also known as the peyote gardens, a sacred space. In the United States, Texas is the only state where peyote grows. Approximately 95% of Texas is privately owned, with only about 2% of public lands, primarily within the Big Bend National Park, exist. This means that the peyote gardens likely fall 100% under private land ownership. And so why is this important? Reduced peyote plants limit the number of peyote sold by peyote distributors and peyote available to harvest for Native American church members. Landowners have concerns with trespassing and illegal harvesting. Land conversion for wind turbine development has potential to drastically alter the natural vegetation, ultimately impacting the habitat. According to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List, peyote is currently categorized as vulnerable. However, the Cactus Conservation Institute, which is run by Dr. Martin Terry, is a nonprofit which is dedicated to the study and preservation of vulnerable cacti in their natural range, starting with peyote and star cactus. They have classified peyote as endangered at the local level, meaning in the state of Texas, it is considered an endangered species. And though there are no explicit protections for the peyote cactus, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act amendments has inadvertently provided protections by legally limiting use, possession, and transportation to only members of the Native American Church and to members of a federally recognized tribe with at least 1/4 Indian blood. Additionally, peyote's classification as a Schedule I substance has also contributed to its protections by limiting possession, use, and transport to only members of the Native American Church. The passing of recent city decriminalization resolutions within the United States has unfortunately failed to consider how the inclusion of a declining species such as peyote will be impacted by an influx of users. The mostly non-Indigenous users will likely have a high potential to impact the already stressed populations of South Texas and Mexico, who are seeking illegal peyote through black market purchase and through illegal harvesting. And so there are essentially two types of threats. One is threats to the population, and the other is threats to the habitat. And some population threats include improper harvesting, which is seen in the image to the left, which shows some peyote that were harvested that they actually cut right into the root of the cactus, which is also referred to as a subterranean stem. Whereas the proper way to harvest this would have been right at the base of the peyote crown and the root. And having harvested peyote in the wild myself, I recognize that this is a very, very difficult task. So I understand the harvesting techniques are very essential. There's also the high demand for legal and illegal peyote that's occurring. There's also the issue with premature harvesting, where when they are harvested prior to seeding, in situ seeding is not occurring, which could have drastic effects to the propagation. And so over the last several years, a renewed interest in peyote has occurred. This is causing an influx of peyote hunters and users into Texas and Mexico, conducting what we know as narco-tourism, psychedelic tourism, and theogenic tourism, drug tourism. And this increased interest has potential to drastically reduce peyote populations to an already taxed population level. And this type of activity also causes strain to the Native American Church, the landowners, and to peyote itself. Some of the habitat threats include root plowing, oil development, disturbance from feral hogs. The largest population in the United States of feral hogs live in South Texas, actually throughout Texas. There's also the issue of ex-urban development and other land conversions. And so Texas is also leading the nation with the largest production of wind energy of any U.S. state, for a total of 22,000 megawatts of wind power gained at the end of 2017. The energy production rate for wind energy is expected to increase. And this map provides an example of wind farm development from 2014, which shows several wind farms that fall directly within peyote habitat. This encroaching threat requires considerable road and infrastructure, such as pads and transmission lines, that has impacted both the population and the habitat and has extirpated many peyote tracts. And so this is a graph that depicts the annual sales from 1974 through 2016 as received from the Texas Department of Public Safety. Since 2008, I have acquired the data annually from that department, but unfortunately, those records were no longer made available after 2016 through an exemption that the department made. So those sales records are no longer available. In addition, in 2019, the Texas Department of Public Safety also relinquished all responsibility for peyote distributor permits. So all of those are now being handled by the DEA, which has already proven to be challenging to me as a researcher to acquire those essential pieces of data. And so to date, little research has been conducted to define what determines the core peyote garden. What is the peyote garden? And little research exists on the description of remaining or potential habitat of the gardens based upon vegetation, soil types, and considered infrastructure using geographic information systems, GIS. And so as you can see in this slide, each map from various researchers all vary considerably, with possibly thousands of acres of difference. And so in order to provide protections, it's important to know what its range, and to know where to focus conservation. And so I don't necessarily want to get into the full details of the development of each map, but I would like to share some of the results. And so five of these maps, as I mentioned, were used from researchers like Edward Anderson, Martin Terry, Stacy Schaefer, Omar Stewart, and Brian Hedler. And so the process is very tedious, and it essentially requires some georeferencing, which is essentially to create a shapefile. And so each of these maps was delineated, essentially drawing precise lines around each identified area. And this requires using various GIS tools, which results in a process known as an overlap analysis. And so that process looks like this. This is the result of of merging of those shapefiles. And so additional tools were also used to develop what I consider to be the common or the core range. And that's the collective range of the original 5 peyote territories that were identified. And so this is the result of what that looks like. So this provides the final overlap analysis, which shows a core range in addition to a calculated number of potential hectares. And those figures I won't address today, just because the results are still very preliminary. And before I put a number out there, I want to be completely positive about what that potential number looks like. And so, but what this work can do is it can serve as a model over time. To visually display the decrease of known habitat over time. And so the overlap analysis will also provide landowners, the Native American church, stakeholders, and allies with visual representation on possible focus areas for conservation efforts going forward. And so to determine the preferred vegetation and soil types of peyote, the overlap analysis data will be carried over into this work as well and used to extract the counties within the United States based upon how the soil was identified, or I'm sorry, based upon the dominant vegetation type. And so this proved challenging because county soil data contains some errors with how the soil was identified. Several counties had different numbering and naming systems that the GIS system could not run properly. And so the results of this analysis were not posted here. So this data actually just shows the potential vegetation, preferred vegetation for 2011 and 2016, and it does not include soil types. Like I said, there were errors with the analysis, which identified roads and other infrastructure as potential vegetation, and those are currently being recalculated. And so what this data can provide is further evidence of the potential habitat of peyote, which can provide peyotists, landowners, stakeholders, and allies with additional indication on what the landscape looks like on a finer spatial scale. And the map and the data also could be used for developing appropriate federal, state, private policy, even tribal policy of what, or tribal policy for peyote habitat within the United States. And so due to the loss of habitat through anthropogenic activities, this process may reveal conservation issues, management opportunities for all parties, but particularly for peyote conservation. And so my last topic is on potential or foreseeable threats to wild peyote populations that may result as part of the psychedelic renaissance. So the psychedelic renaissance has me concerned for several reasons. The psychedelic renaissance has potential to exponentially increase demand of peyote in its natural habitat by non-Indigenous peoples, reducing availability of peyote for bona fide Native American church use and potentially leading to its extinction. This increased demand may further ostracize Texas landowners from allowing access and harvest of peyote by the Native American church. Some Texas landowners still remember dealing with hippies of the 60s and the 70s who cut fences, trespassed, camped, and illegally and unsustainably harvested peyote on their land. And that still resonates with them today. As members of the Native American church value wild peyote the most, the potential increased demand that will likely result from the psychedelic renaissance will likely increase the cost of wild peyote, making it unaffordable for many Native American church members. It is quite possible that in the future, only billionaires, millionaires, and their friends will likely be the only people who can afford wild peyote and have access. And you have to remember that many members of federally recognized tribes, myself included, who are legally allowed to use and possess peyote, rely almost exclusively upon the Indian Health Service for medical care. And the Indian Health Service is one of the lowest, if not the lowest, funded healthcare system in the United States. Therefore, many Native American church members use peyote to treat serious health problems. There are also many other issues on the reservation that peyote is used for in which there is no other solution. For example, alcoholism, drug addiction, violence, abuse, poverty, neglect, historical trauma, suicide, depression, the list goes on. This is not to say that non-Indigenous peoples of the United States don't have these same issues. It's just that there is a huge disparity when comparing Indigenous peoples with non-Indigenous peoples regarding access to resources and services that promote health and well-being. Another issue is with cultural appropriation, which has been described as an adoption of elements of one culture for use by another. I've heard the word appropriation mentioned several times during this conference. However, it hasn't really been explained, and it's perhaps one of the most significant issues associated with the psychedelic renaissance. When it comes, so it hasn't really been explained. Let me go back. And it's perhaps one of the most significant issues associated with the psychedelic renaissance. When it comes to the harvest, collection, and use of biological species, such as peyote. Cultural appropriation occurs when a dominant culture takes from a minority culture, usually without approval, consent, or even consultation with the people from where the culture originated. So cultural appropriation is a form of colonialism where the colonizers taking something that is not theirs for their own benefit without considering the subsequent impacts upon the people from where the benefit was acquired. For example, practices that Indigenous peoples were once condemned, murdered, and imprisoned for are now sought after by the dominant Western culture. The renewed interest by Western culture in the use of peyote, San Pedro, iboga, ayahuasca, and other plant medicines can be viewed as an example of cultural misappropriation. Cultural appropriations can also include the exploitation of another culture's religious and cultural traditions, fashion, symbols, language, and music. And this is often done by the members of the dominant culture to make money for profit, more so than to promote true healing and traditional teachings of the Indigenous cultures for which it was appropriated. And so what does cultural misappropriation really look like? Cultural misappropriation is using elements from the peyote practice in an ayahuasca ceremony or smoking marijuana in conjunction with the peyote ceremony. It looks like a sweat lodge ceremony where people are using both peyote and ayahuasca. It looks like the deaths of human beings who trusted a man who had no formal Indigenous training on how to build a proper sweat lodge. It looks like academic publications photographs and video of traditional indigenous ceremonies specifically asked not to be shared with people outside of culture. All of these can be not just physically dangerous, but spiritually dangerous for all parties, including the plant medicines. And so the idea that agendas for natural rights to plant medicines have the potential to exterminate a species and possibly an entire culture is continuation of colonialism and cultural misappropriation. And so I would like each of you to think about how these threats cumulatively contribute to the future of wild peyote. Considering the history of dominant Western environmental stewardship, conservation of wild peyote in its natural habitat is going to be a monumental challenge. And I hope you join me in recognizing that nature has rights too. Those living non-humans are our relatives. Peyote is my ancestor. And as we prepare to face the challenges of species extinction, climate change, and ecocide, we as the Indigenous peoples want to participate in discussions and policy development for research, sustainable economies, energies, and environmental adaptation. So, Usen, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dawn. So kind of along those lines, we have some folks who are participating in today's discussion who are curious to know what sort of guidance you would give decriminalization groups and sort of what you spoke to this a bit, but what you think of the coming commercialization, but what guidance?
So I have been lucky to be working with the National Council for Native American Churches and also the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative, who's also, they're also a nonprofit conservation effort that's, working on, in situ cultivation. And we have offered to provide decriminalization movements within cities on proper education. And really that has been my research for the last 10 plus years, is trying to educate not just non-Indigenous people, but also educating Indigenous people on what is happening with peyote's habitat, because there really is a disconnection between the land and the medicine. And I heard Troy mention that very briefly this morning, that there is the middleman. We have these peyote distributors, and many tribes like the Comanche have the benefit of not having this middleman. But for people like my tribe, we don't have that benefit. So we do have to go through these peyote distributors. And for a lot of people, there is a disconnection between what it takes for that plant and that medicine to come into your ceremony. And so I think that educating people in regard to the biological structure of peyote, what it takes for peyote to actually be a mature plant. Because like I said, when I was a young girl, the medicines that I was ingesting were from plants that were much older than myself. And so I think that that's an important relationship to make and an important relationship to have. And so in trying to build what's happening with this decriminalization movement, it's really bringing Indigenous people to that table, not excluding us, including us. We have been asking for, hundreds of years to have our voices heard, and we're still continuing to ask for that.
Thank you. We have another question that I'll just read it too, if that's all right. When we take into account the crisis the Earth is in, there may be a path toward allying instead of appropriating cultures, or might there be a path toward allying instead of appropriating cultures that are more in line with regeneration of our Earth, or adopting with consent, permission, and collaboration? So I guess, and there's some other questions about, should non-Indigenous people or people who are not part of the Native American Church not use peyote? So just kind of more discussion around that, if you would be so kind.
So that's like a heavy, multi-layered question. I, as an Indigenous woman, who has been using peyote, my entire life, I have a really hard time with the question of should non-Indigenous people be using medicine. And one of the issues I have is because there's this issue of appropriation. And I talked at length about that. It's a hard position to be in because I have to be very cautious of the words that I use, because I feel like I am not just a scientist and a researcher, but I feel like in many ways I can be an advocate for peyote, and trying to help people recognize that peyote is and is becoming an endangered species, and we should be trying our best to preserve that. I know that there are discussions around cultivation. There's discussions about allying with Mexico, but Mexico has their own Indigenous people. There are, several tribes of Indigenous people in Mexico who use this and who legally have the right to use peyote. And so I feel like we shouldn't be looking at those options as a plan, plan A. Those should be plans X, Y, and Z. We should be doing everything we can to try and promote healthy relationships with landowners in the United States, and also creating healthy relationships with allies, with people like the IPCI, with the Cactus Conservation Institute, with other NGOs, and even with SIA, entities like that. I think would be what needs to happen in order to help spread this educational component that is lacking from all of this.
Thank you. We have several people who are curious about the main cultural reasons behind the preference for wild versus cultivated peyote. Cultivation makes sense from a conservation point of view, but what about the cultural traditions?
That's a really heavy question too. But in my research and just in participating in ceremonies, you hear a lot of talk about peyote and how peyote is pure, and that's what they want. They want that pure medicine. And there's also the concern that by taking peyote out of its natural habitat, that it could eventually over time evolve into something else. And so where peyote is growing now, it has this amazing habitat that it lives in. And so everything that's in that habitat is what goes into this medicine. And so who's to say that when we take it out of that habitat, if we're going to be getting that same medicine that nature intended, but also is it the same medicine that my ancestors were a part of? And so I'm not saying that cultivation, I'm against cultivation, or I've heard the question about synthetics. I don't know how you synthesize mescaline, but if synthesizing mescaline involves leaving wild populations alone, then create all the synthetic mescaline you want. I advocate, and my research shows that wild populations of peyote need to be left alone.
Thank you. We have requests for copies of your paper or a link to your paper. So if you're willing to share that or any of your research, maybe we can coordinate after this and put it on the Chakurna website. Okay. There are many people asking this question. Do you have any information on the way growing peyote on top of San Pedro body affects the spiritual aspects of the peyote?
That is, that's something that's very interesting to me, because I've seen images, I've seen the work that that people are doing, and I've also seen the work, that CCI, the Cactus Conservation Institute, is doing with grafting. And I can't really talk to that. And I also see that as being spiritually dangerous as well, because you're mixing the medicine from San Pedro and peyote together. And so but that's really not something I would want and feel comfortable speaking to at this point.
And there was a question about one of the graphs. So perhaps you can unpack this a little bit. Regarding the graph of Texas peyote sales in buttons and dollars, what factors account for the lines intersecting and then diverging such that buttons increase while dollars decrease?
So that is, this has always been like a really interesting topic for me, because I have always really wondered, what does this graph say? And Kevin Feeney did a really great presentation yesterday. So I would actually advise that whoever asked this question revisit Kevin's presentation from yesterday, because he did an amazing job at describing market values. Because it's a complicated question to answer. Because over time, peyote cost has increased, but it has also decreased within the last 3 years, if not longer. And so I hope my graph came up.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really hard to say what is causing that. Is that because there's less peyote buttons available from peyote dealers? Does that mean there's not enough wild peyote buttons to harvest? And in regard to, everything else, it could be, maybe people weren't traveling to Texas because they couldn't afford the gas. I mean, there's lots of things to consider. And I've asked a lot of those questions, but I would definitely recommend visiting Kevin Feeney's presentation from yesterday, because he does a great job in talking about market.
Thank you. One or two people had a question about data on the illegal harvesting of peyote by non-natives, and then curiosity around widespread cultivation of peyote in greenhouses or other suitable environments that would mitigate the habitat loss and other issues that you've spoken of with wild peyote.
So I'm not quite sure I understood the question.
Well, first part of the question was, is there data on the illegal harvesting of peyote by non-natives?
So there isn't. It's also the same for illegal harvesting by Indigenous people. There's no data available, but we know it's happening. And we know it's happening because it's been observed, it's been witnessed. There's, landowners talk about poachers, and poachers come in all colors. So that would probably be almost impossible to determine.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess the second part of the question just kind of dealt with, well, what about cultivation in greenhouses or non-Indigenous people growing their own peyote rather than harvesting?
I think that Indigenous people want to grow their own peyote. Troy mentioned this earlier, that the Comanches have been doing it for years. And there are a lot of Indigenous people who do have peyotes growing in their own home, because if you think about it, it's just like your own personal vegetable garden. When you start putting time and energy and love and care into these vegetables you grow at home, you put a lot of respect into that. And so you're not going to waste that. You don't want to waste all that food that you took all of these months nurturing, and sometimes, and in many cases, years. Because it's not just, one patch of food 1 year. It's the work that goes in after the harvest has taken place. So it's this, cyclic process, right? And so I think Indigenous people, and I can say this for myself too, I believe that we should have the right to cultivate our own medicine, but we should have the right to do it in a way that is comfortable to us, and in a way that's also respectful to peyote.
Dawn, would you do me a favor and refresh your browser window because you're the star here?
Okay, I'll try.
Thank you. Hopefully we haven't lost you. We had a little more time for question and answer, and everyone is loving and appreciating your presentation so much.
I don't know if that worked.
It did. It did. Yeah. I'd like to pose a question or discuss something for a moment. I'm an attorney, and I've been involved in a variety of policy reform issues over the years. And I remember that in California, now I'm just speaking about cannabis, with Prop 64, tribes were not consulted at all in the passing of that law, which meant that essentially tribes were left out of that conversation. And there was this really absurd regulatory fix, quote unquote, in the rules and regulations that came out after the initiative that required that tribes waive their sovereignty in order to sell into the larger regulated market or participate in that market. And it was all and continues to be very unfortunate. So I appreciate that there is a conversation now with you and other people who are participating in this summit and in other conversations around these issues. And I just am curious about what effective ways that you think that we can continue conversations going forward and come from a place of collaboration. Yeah, that's kind of my question.
I think that, just being mindful that Indigenous peoples have different rights and have, I guess, I don't know if I want to say additional rights, but we have these treaties that are in place with the United States government, which is not to say that all these treaties are healthy and alive and all of those things, because most likely all treaties have been broken, but we still have a relationship. And it's important to be mindful too that with this pandemic, Indigenous people were also not considered for a stimulus package. For whatever reason, I have no idea. It makes no sense to me, because we have that quote unquote direct relationship as wards of the government with the United States. And yet we are always continually left out. And I heard presentations yesterday that were talking about the rights of Indigenous people and looking and considering how these plant rights affect Indigenous people. And not one time did I hear anybody from the United States say Native American people. I heard them say South American Indigenous people before they said Native American people of the United States. So that's how little we are looked upon. And so to try to break that barrier is very, very challenging when we are continually marginalized. We are continually oppressed. And even when we're trying to make space for ourselves at the table, we're continually pushed to the back because there's a non-Indigenous person who has a little bit more experience than an Indigenous person. It's really, really frustrating. It's very frustrating to have to experience that, not just at platforms like this, but in your daily life. Myself, I fall under various forms of government. I fall under the US government. I fall under the state of Idaho government. I fall under city government. And then I fall under tribal government. So I'm like completely overregulated. When will that stop? So it's complicated, Ariel.
Okay. Fair enough. Well, we appreciate you being here today so much. If you have anything else that you would like to share as a final thought, because we just have a couple more minutes and we're wrapping up, please do.
I was just checking some of the comments because that's been kind of really, really interesting to read. Yeah. I just, want to end, I guess, with saying that, this research that I do with peyote, it's very, very challenging. And I mentioned that early on in the presentation that, as an Indigenous person, people say, oh, it must be so easy to do this work because you're Native. And it's actually 10 times harder because I'm an Indigenous person and I'm a woman on top of that. And so I'm trying to not just break a barrier, I'm trying to create a voice for Indigenous people, trying to create a voice that holds an Indigenous perspective of peyote. And so with the research that I do, I don't want to push away potential allies because they are important. And so, the research that I do, it comes from a very Indigenous place because I have known peyote my entire life. My mother ingested peyote while I was in utero. So I've had this innate relationship with peyote. And so I no longer feel like it's a right that I have to use peyote. It is my responsibility as a peyote user to make sure that I work my hardest and that I try as hard as I can to protect this plant for use by Indigenous peoples, but also to protect the plant for peyote itself.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are all very grateful for you coming and speaking to us today.
Yes. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, folks, we're taking a break and we will see you on the other side.